Well, hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to be talking about a very influential and controversial album. And it's one that's only gone up in esteem in the eyes of many over the years, but at the time it was considered very, very weird. And this is, of course, Peter Gabriel's third album, typically referred to as the Melt album. Now, to understand why both sonically and thematically it was weird, you have to understand the function of the modern Western style drum kit in most forms of music. Now, most people trace the origin of the drum kit to an early 20th century jazz drummer called Baby Dodds. It was his setup of percussive instruments that first looked and sounded and to a degree felt like the modern drum kit. And then, of course, subsequent drum superstars, namely Gene Krupa, helped to solidify the modern layout and style of a drum kit. And it remained that way for most music up until the present day. So the basic setup of a drum kit is you've got your cymbals, some of which are ride cymbals, which have a heavier sound, some of which are crash cymbals, which, like the name would indicate, usually provide accents to the music. And then there's the hi-hat, which can be used much like a ride cymbal to keep the time itself, or for various sonic flourishes, if you will. In jazz, it's typically used to keep the beat on 2 and 4. Now, this basic setup of the cymbals keeping the time is true for, let's say, jazz. It's certainly true there. For most forms of Western pop music, for almost all forms of rock music, for country and Western music, and even in hip hop, the drum machines that are used to keep the beat tend to simulate the sounds of cymbals and, of course, of modern Western drums. Peter Gabriel decided to do something different. And to understand this, we have to understand that cymbals and membranophones, meaning drums with a tightened skin over a wooden spherical object, come from different parts of the world. Cymbals are primarily an Asian invention, and specifically West Asian. Ancient Armenia is sometimes credited as the birthplace of what we would recognize as the cymbal, and this spread to other parts of the Near East, ancient Babylonia, eventually into ancient Europe, Greece, and Rome. East Asia had its own version of metallic percussion, the gongs or tam-tams of places like China and Japan and Korea, and of course the gamelan, which is a metallic tuned percussive instrument that is indigenous to Indonesia. India had a lot of cymbals as well, dating back to the very ancient world. By contrast, membranophones, the drum that you play with the skin, so a tom-tom, a proto-snare drum, a conga, a bongo, these have their origin in Africa. And of course, through trade and through cultural ties and communications, both in the ancient and modern world, these things have combined. We're now for the last several centuries, European orchestras have both membranophones like the timpani and also crash cymbals. And of course, we have both on the drum set. Even though we call it the drum set, though, in most music, if you actually want to see how many times the drum stick, hits a particular section of that drum set, the cymbals, including the hi-hat, are being hit more than the drums themselves. Not so with Peter Gabriel's album. He specifically instructed the two drummers on the album, who played on various tracks, not to use any cymbals, to create rhythm, to create sonic flourishes, to create accents, all the other things that percussionists do, only on the membranophones, only on the drums themselves. And this was very unique to rock or pop music, although there were, of course, some there was, of course, a background to this. Ginger Baker, the great drummer for Cream and many others, while he did ride the cymbal occasionally, he was very, very well known for keeping time on the tom-toms. And this was because Ginger was extremely inspired by traditional classical African drumming, which is something he himself learned from the English jazz drummer, Phil Seaman, who himself was very interested in collecting rare recordings of African classical percussionists, particularly from West Africa. And so there were some things that were predecessors to this, but in terms of an entire album, symbol free, in the middle of the late 70s, very, very rare. What did you have on American radio at the time? Foreigner was huge. Boston was huge. Journey was huge. And so out comes Peter Gabriel from an England torn between the prog rock of the early 70s and the punk and post-punk music of the late 70s, and he comes out of left field with a highly experimental album using drums to really create the sound. Very different than Genesis, where it was all about the chords, particularly the keyboard chords that created that ethereal Genesis sound. Gabriel was, of course, long gone from Genesis by now, but he was really delving deeper and deeper into experimental territory. Now, the two drummers he used were Jerry Marotta, wonderful session drummer who went on to play with Gabriel a lot after this, and of course his old friend from Genesis, Phil Collins, who they say was less intimidated by the unusual request to forgo cymbals than Marotta was, because studio drumming, session drumming, was very much built around what you can do with a traditional drum set. The sound was also shaped by Larry Frost's highly experimental synthesizers. There was Tony Levin playing the Chapman stick. Everything sounded different, and the label that Gabriel was on, Atlantic, rejected it. They thought it was too obscure. They thought even thematically, the song Biko, about the South African civil rights activist Stephen Biko, who was killed by the police during the apartheid regime, they thought it was just all too political, too obscure, too weird for audiences that wanted to hear, love songs, for lack of a better word. But he persevered. Mercury eventually put the album out, and it wasn't a huge hit, but it did sell, and it was very influential because of another percussive technique used. Not only were cymbals completely absent, but the great recording engineer Hugh Padgham came up with something quite by accident in the studio called the gated effect, the gated drum sound. And this was something that many say went on to define 80s drum recording for pop and rock music. Now, the best way to describe it, and you'll know it when you hear it, is a drum that has a huge attack, but then after the huge attack, the reverb is cut off. So it's sort of, you're getting all the reverb without the sustain. It's just like an unnatural sound that's very difficult to replicate live, absent a complicated PA system where you have double miking techniques and all sorts of other effects on the console. But in the studio, it was easy to create. And Hugh Padgham discovered this when he left a talkback mic on when he was recording Phil Collins's parts for this album. Phil, of course, went on a few years later to famously use that gated drum sound in the Air Tonight. And so, even though the album was conceived as something very experimental, its influence on drums were felt throughout the 80s, when the rather hyper-realistic drum sound of the 70s, involving multi-miking and generally a natural sustain, which in the studios of the time tended to be rather some would say flat, others would say natural, but because you had multi-miking on the drums, mainly in the 70s, into multi-track tapes, the drums were somewhat subdued with less room echo than you'd have in the pre-multi-track days of the 50s and 60s. Gated drumming changed all that. The drums became huge, some would say even overpowering, and this technique influenced the recording of the acoustic drum set. I think it influenced the ability of listeners to process the mechanical sound of Simmons electronic drums and the similar sounds being produced by the ubiquitous drum machines of the 80s. And these are, of course, used on some of the top-selling dance and pop tracks of the time. And the gated drum sound was used on so many rock and pop recordings. And it really was introduced on this Peter Gabriel album. So the idea that rhythm and percussion should shape a sound, a sonic palette, if you will, and this idea of the gated drum, the incorporation of drum machines, which started before Gabriel. Sly and the Family Stone used it long before. It's a family affair, but mainstreaming it even beyond Sly's very successful experimentation with it, Peter Gabriel brought it directly to the rock world. So all of this, the gated effect, the non-Western percussion, the lack of cymbals, the incorporation of drum machines, all of this paved the way for the very unexperimental but very futuristic sounding music of the 80s. And this is kind of true with any sort of musical innovation. It always starts in the avant-garde or semi-avant-garde or experimental realm, and then these same sounds are later used to produce relatively commercial music. Same was true with multi-tracking, experiments with overdubbing, loads of overdubbing and things like Pet Sounds and Sergeant Pepper was used to a rather experimental effect, and multi-tracking eventually by the 70s just became a way to hear all of the sounds in a balance where the musicians and engineer had more control and genuinely and generally with more detail than non-multi-track taping could achieve. Peter Gabriel, with his fourth album, sometimes known as Security, continued along these lines. No cymbals, very percussive and rhythmically driven. And by then, it was really already established that the sound of the 80s would be very percussive, that big drum sound, and that experiments with synthesizers and drum machines were now not only acceptable, but almost mandatory by the mid 80s, certainly, if you wanted a pop or even, in many cases, a rock hit. But the third album by Peter Gabriel really set that in motion, which is why, even though the album itself doesn't sound like your quintessential 80s record, the highly refined experimental sounds on the album definitely paved the way for that classic 80s sound. Great album, great writing, really interesting stuff, even putting the experimental sound palette aside. Have a listen. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.